About 2,500 years ago, there lived a man named Jeremiah. He was a prophet who lived in an ancient Israel during one of the most politically and religiously corrupt times of Israel's history. Here's how it was supposed to go. God called the nation in general, and its leaders in particular, to believe and trust in the one true God of Israel. But during Jeremiah's time, the leaders of the nation started worshiping other gods. The word that the Bible uses for this is idolatry. Now, if you are like me, you start to cringe whenever you hear religious words like idolatry. I mean, what is the big deal? Jesus said that he had other sheep that are not of his fold. There are people in the Old Testament and New Testament who actually worship other gods but are shown to be faithful anyway. The Magi who followed a star that led them to Jesus is a good example of this. So we come back to the question, what's the big deal with idolatry? I'm about to tell you. Jeremiah and the other prophets believed that the particular God of Israel cared deeply about justice. Jeremiah thought that our understanding of a just God and our understanding of justice should be connected. Jeremiah knew that the true God cares about the plight of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and those who are on the margins of society. So if you believe in the God who cares about those people, then according to Jeremiah, you should care about them too. But during Jeremiah's time, the political and religious leaders believed in other gods. They believed in the gods of oppression. They believed in the gods that justified their shared desire for power and wealth and prestige at the expense of others. They didn't believe in the God of Israel. For the God of Israel is consumed with a desire for justice, a fierce desire for justice for those who are in need. But Jeremiah did believe in the God of Israel. And so like that God, he was also consumed with a desire for justice for those in need. And here's the thing. I personally do not care if you call God Allah or Buddha or Spirit or Jesus or Hey You or Father or Mother or nothing at all or whatever. God has many different names in the Bible. What I do care about is that whatever name we call God, we recognize that God desires a more just world. And then we partner up with God and with others and make the world a more just place. Jeremiah was brilliant because he knew that justice issues are all connected. Many scholars working in the field of justice today claim that justice issues are all interrelated. In other words, an injustice in one area does not stay isolated in that one area. Injustice in one area leads to injustice in other areas. It snowballs out of control. But the good news is that the reverse is also true. We often feel that we have to take on every social justice issue. But acting for justice in one area tends to bring more justice to other areas as well. And here's what this meant for Jeremiah and his people. Jeremiah warned that if political and religious leaders worshiped the idolatrous gods of oppression, that the leaders would also become oppressive. They would become consumed with a desire for power and wealth or prestige. Jeremiah warned that their greed would become contagious and spread throughout the nation. It would snowball. The nation as a whole would become consumed by greed, and the nation would destroy itself with greed and violence. That is the apocalyptic warning of the prophets and of Jeremiah. But Jeremiah took it a step further because he knew that justice issues are all interconnected and injustice snowballs out of control. So much so that in our passage this morning, the prophet Jeremiah warned 2,500 years ago that a nation consumed with greed and violence and power would not only destroy itself, but it would also destroy the planet. Jeremiah claimed that disaster leads to disaster, including ecological disaster. He warned that the earth would be laid waste and void, the heavens would go dark, the mountains would quake, and the land that produced fruit would become a desert. Indeed, the whole earth would mourn. Is any of this sounding familiar to you? Why did this happen? Jeremiah says a few verses before our passage that this happened because your ways and your doings have brought this upon you. That was Jeremiah's apocalyptic warning. But his warning was meant to inspire hope, because the people brought this upon themselves with their destructive ways. Jeremiah's hope was that the people could take responsibility to change their ways. It's interesting because Jeremiah could have delivered this warning today. Today we have political and religious leaders who claim to worship God, but they don't. They worship idols. We know this because many of them don't actually care about the poor. In fact, they attempt to implement drastic reductions in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, along with cuts for food stamps, housing assistance, and family assistance to those who are most in need. Let's be clear. These policies are un-Christian. Jeremiah claimed that leaders who want to implement such policies do not worship the God of Israel. They worship the gods of oppression. They worship the idols of greed, power, and prestige. They go against the God who desires justice for the poor, the weak, and the marginalized. Many of our political and religious leaders today do not worship the God of Israel, even though they claim to. They worship the gods of greed and oppression. Fortunately, today we have prophets who are rising up like Jeremiah to speak truth about injustice and how we might live in a more just world. One of our greatest prophets of our time is a 16-year-old girl from Sweden named Greta Thunberg. Greta is a climate change activist who, like Jeremiah, is determined to speak truth to power. This last Friday, Greta was in Washington, D.C. to lead a protest at the White House, demanding that U.S. politicians at the very top listen to science and take responsibility. Like Jeremiah 2,500 years ago, Greta is also an apocalyptic prophet. She warns that, quote, "Our house is on fire. We are facing a disaster of unspoken sufferings for enormous amounts of people. And now is not the time for speaking politely or focusing on what we can or cannot say. Now is the time to speak clearly." And we saw the results of the unspoken suffering for enormous amounts of people brought on by climate change during the last few weeks as Hurricane Dorian destroyed the Bahamian Islands. Climate change increases the destruction of natural disasters like Dorian. These disasters snowball out of control, and their most traumatic effects are on the poor. Rich countries like ours have greatly benefited from fossil fuel consumption, while countries that are already poor suffer the most from the resulting chaos of climate change. To add to this injustice, those suffering the destruction of their homes and their livelihood wrought on by Dorian tried to find refuge in the United States. But unfortunately, they met a U.S. president who decided it was more important to strike fear in our hearts by claiming that many of these refugees would be, quote, very bad and very, very bad people and very bad gang members. Do you get the sense, like I do, that calling brown people very bad gang members is one of his favorite hits? The injustice spreads because it leads to fear and dehumanization of those who are already suffering enough. Well, I have news for our president. We Christians don't live by fear. We live by hope. We live by love. We live by justice. And yet, hope can be very difficult to come by when it comes to the climate crisis. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that we have just 12 years left to turn the tide. That 12-year benchmark could easily lead us into despair. But friends, we don't have time for despair. The prophets have spoken. 2,500 years ago, the prophet Jeremiah claimed that the leaders of his nation had a responsibility to care for the poor, the weak, and the marginalized, and he warned that if they didn't, it would destroy the whole earth. And today, the prophet Greta Thunberg is telling us that we are destroying the earth. But Jeremiah and Greta remind us that hope is not lost. There is something we can do. Yes, you and I can make personal decisions to drive less and fly less and recycle more. But you and I can only do so much. More than what we as individuals or as a church body can do on our own, we need to elect political leaders who actually believe that science is a good thing. We need to elect political leaders who will take the lead in solving climate crisis and the injustice that it produces throughout the world. And for that to happen, as individuals and as a church, we need to have the courage and the boldness to raise our voices in support of climate justice policies and hold our politicians accountable. This coming Friday, high school students like Greta throughout the world will march in the streets of our cities to demand more just climate change policies. The students have asked adults to join them. I plan to be at the march here in Portland, and if any of you would like to join us, please let me know and I will give you information on how we can team up with the young people who are leading us into a more just climate future. Because the prophets of old and the young prophets of today are calling upon us. May we heed their call. Amen.
Hi everyone, this is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. We are so glad that you found this podcast. All of our podcasts will always be free, but we rely on the financial support of our members and our friends. If this podcast meant something to you, you can help us out in two ways. You can share this podcast with someone you think might be interested. You can also help us financially by donating to the wonderful missions we have here at Clackamas United Church of Christ. To do so, you can go to our Facebook page, our website, or our YouTube channel, and click on the Donate Here button. Our worship services start at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months when we start at 10 o'clock. If you would like more information on our church, you can visit our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.